Hi, my name is Greg Burkhart, Director of Safety and Training at the AGC in Northwest Ohio. I'd like to talk today about scaffolds on the construction site. 1926 Subpart L, scaffolding. Scaffold injuries and fatalities continue despite several Subpart L provisions that have been made. Almost 4,500 scaffold injuries annually, and OSHA says that there are 60 scaffold-related fatalities every year. Bureau of Labor statistics say that 72% of the workers injured on scaffolds attribute that accident to bad planking, breaking, slips, or falling objects, while 70% of the workers learn safety requirements on the job. OSHA requires that the employer train their employees on situations like for scaffolding or things like that prior to using the scaffold. So that's an indication right there that 70% of the workers are getting out on the job site prior to any type of scaffolding training. 25% received absolutely no training at all on scaffolding. They're just told to go out and work on the scaffold. A third of scaffolds are equipped with guardrails. Even though at the 10-foot level, it is required that we provide some type of fall protection for scaffolding for our employees to protect them from the fall. Keeping in mind, of course, that 10 foot is the OSHA standard, and as we talk about later in this program, you'll find out that our contractors in Northwest Ohio require scaffolding guardrails at 6 feet, which is the standard for construction where we have to protect our employees from falls. 1926-450 covers all scaffolds used in the workplaces, supported scaffolds, suspended scaffolds. We're not going to talk about suspended scaffolds. That takes a lot more time and it is very complicated. So we're not going to talk about suspended scaffolds. What you need to know is that you have to have special training to be able to set those up and also to even work on them. We're not going to talk about crane or derrick suspended platform scaffolds because that's covered under 1926-550. Aerial lifts, that is a mobile scaffold, but that's covered under 1926.453, and we will not have the time today to talk about that either. We will cover that at a later date. So OSHA requires competent person for several programs on a construction site, and one of them being scaffold. In the preamble on page 46,059, it specifically spells out that the competent person for scaffolding must have the knowledge of structural integrity. They also must understand the maintenance of scaffolding, the effects of the potential hazards, and also a great knowledge of the standard for scaffold. 1926-451, we're going to talk a little bit about the capacity, scaffold platform construction, criteria for supported scaffolds, access, ladders, how do we access that scaffolding, the use of scaffolding, fall protection around the scaffolding, and falling object protection. And as we know, these standards are written in blood. Somebody has been injured or killed, and that's why we're going to talk about all of this stuff, the access, the use, the fall protection, and falling objects from a scaffold. 1926-451A specifically spells out the capacity of any type of scaffold that's in use, and it must support without failure 4 times the maximum intended load of that scaffold. So what we have to keep in mind is the weight of our brick and block, the weight of our mortar tubs, the weight of any lumber that we use on there, the weight of any equipment that we put on there that we may be setting onto the building or whatnot. And also, obviously, the weight of the personnel and their tools. These are all considerations that we must take into account when we're working on scaffold. Scaffold plank construction must be planked as fully as possible, meaning there are no gaps or the gaps are limited to 1 inch or less. You can have a maximum 9.5-inch gap around uprights when extending the platform width with side brackets. This does not apply to walkways during erection and dismantling. The platforms must be at least 18 inches wide when we're working on that. And we must install guardrails or a personal fall arrest system if we don't have guardrails up. The ladder jacks, the pump jacks, roof bracket scaffold must be at least 12 inches wide before we put any personnel on those. In this picture, you can see where there are two people standing on scaffolding. No guardrails. They are standing what appears to be on a single plank. And I just said, remember, we have to have that be at least 18 inches wide when we're working on a scaffold. For our construction, the front of the scaffold must be within 14 inches of the face of our work. If we're working on an outrigger, the scaffolding must be at least 3 inches from our face of our work. If you're doing plastering operations, it's 18 inches. And unless secured, platforms must extend a minimum of 6 inches over the support. If it's less than 6 inches, then we must install cleats to keep that planking from sliding back and forth and falling off of that support piece. Platforms less than 10 feet, the maximum extension over the support is 12 inches. And the reason for that is if we don't have guardrail up there and we walk out to that overhang, that could just catapult us, the teeter-totter effect, and we could slip and fall from that level. Now, platforms over 10 feet, the maximum extension over the support is 18 inches. We must overlap the platforms only over the support. So anytime we have two platforms, two planks meeting, we must make sure that they have a minimum overlap of a support of at least 12 inches. When we have planks laid at angles, we're going around a corner, the plank laid at an angle other than the 90 degrees must be laid on the support first. And then the plank at a 90-degree angle from the supports will be laid on top of that. That limits the ability for the planking, the shorter planking, laid at an angle other than 90 degrees, that limits the chance of that slipping and sliding. Here we see an individual on a scaffold. I guess I would call that a scaffold. And you can see on the right side that the overhang is much more than 18 inches. If that individual would keep walking out to the right, the chance for that scaffold to slip, causing him to fall, is great. This situation, the same thing. We see planking that is 6 foot extended, no guardrails. People walk out over that, and that planking could catapult them, could teeter-totter them, whatever you want to call it, down to the ground below. In this situation, same thing. There is much more wrong with this, but what I wanted to show you is that that cannot be supported like that. You can have only a maximum of 18 inches overhanging that support. Here's a good example of two supports coming across each other, and they are supported on the horizontal cross member of the scaffold. And here again is another picture of a bad plank, a bad end. That planking on the far right should not even be on there. But it overhangs much more than 18 inches. So if somebody would walk out onto that scaffold, they could catapult themselves right down to the ground from there. 451B, scaffold platform construction, no painting of scaffold, planks, or mud sills. Why no painting? Because it hides the cracks and it also could make the boards slippery. So we want to be able to identify any defects in the boards, in the planks, and we want to make sure that we don't make those any more slippery than they are with mud, ice, rain on there. Mixing of components from different scaffolds, unless they match, we cannot do that. If we have to use a hammer or anything like that to pound two components together, they do not match, and we cannot do that. Here we have a hodgepodge of scaffolding attempts, power lines nearby. It's just a mess up there. And now keep in mind that a lot of these pictures are taken by OSHA. The angle from one to the other is wrong. We're using different components from different scaffolding. I get a lot of laughs in this one when I show this in class. And for an individual to work on that, putting their own life at risk is just crazy in my mind. Here again, different components for scaffolding. We don't have them overhanging properly. Not enough overhang. Those boards could slide, fall. A lot of problems with that scaffold also. Here we have a pick that is supported by guardrail cable. That's a very brave individual that would work up on top of that. At no point should anybody be exposed to that at all. Supported scaffolds, guys, ties, or braces required at a 4:1 height ratio. So what we're saying is if our base of our scaffold is 5 foot wide and we go up 20 feet, we must tie into the structure or increase the base width of our scaffold. So at 20 feet, 4:1 height ratio, the base width of my scaffold is 5 foot. I must tie in at 20 feet. Or I can increase the base width of my scaffold, which I could put an outrigger on there, a 30-inch outrigger, a 2-foot outrigger, whatever the case may be. Increase the base width to, say, 7 feet. 7 times 4 would be 28 feet. I would not have to tie in till 28 feet tall. After that, we must tie in every 26 feet going up. Those must be installed at each end of the scaffold. They also must be installed at horizontal components. So wherever my planks, my picks are resting, I must tie into the building with a brace at that level, not halfway between a pick. It's got to be at the horizontal support. You should also remember that anytime you're building a lengthy scaffold, anything greater than 30 feet, you should break the scaffold at 30 feet horizontally. And the reason for that is if part of that gets pulled down from a blown down or a forklift or a collapse, it's not taking the whole scaffold down. So at 30 feet, we want to put 2 bucks side by side and not tie in the planking so that in the event of a collapse, only 30 feet of that will come down. Here's a diagram. Anything less than 3 foot, we have to tie in at that 20 foot mark. Anything greater than 3 feet, and we can tie in at that 4:1 ratio. This picture shows a scaffold that is higher than 20 feet. The red circle indicates that there is a brace there tied back into the building, but it is also not at a horizontal member. It's in the middle of a buck. And we have to keep in mind, we have to support it, tie it back into the building at that horizontal brace. Bracing required to prevent tipping over for all eccentric applied loads. Scaffold must bear on base plates and mud sills or other firm foundations. The footings must be rigid and no settling or displacement of those footings. So our base plates, our footing for our scaffolds must be solid, firm foundations. As we can see in the upper right picture, it shows our base plates, the legs of our scaffold. They're on brick and block. That is unacceptable. The lower right picture shows an individual standing on what appears to be a sawhorse on a scaffold. And we cannot use things like that to gain further height on a scaffold. Here's another picture of scaffolding footing resting on bases that are unacceptable per the OSHA standard. Those objects, those brick and block, here again will not support 4 times the maximum intended load of a scaffold. So anytime we see this, competent person or anybody need to understand that this is unacceptable, and this could cause a collapse, and this could cause serious injury or death to an individual. Same with this picture. What we have to remember on these scaffolds are built with every component, tested with every component in place. This shows a leg of a scaffold with no base plate on it. That will punch through that block, causing that scaffold to collapse. So anytime we build a scaffold, we must have base plates on it, we must have wheels on it, whatever we're using. We cannot simply put this on a concrete floor or wood and expect that to withstand the maximum intended load that we have planned on that scaffold. Loose brick, loose block, chunks of concrete, these are all unacceptable things for base plates for any type of footing support for scaffold. This looks good, but that is not an adequate mud sill. It is simply a sheet of plywood. We need more as a mud sill than just that. Our scaffold footing here again, we have the wheels on it, but if you look closely at the bottom, it's sitting on plywood, uneven plywood that will not fly. Somebody could get injured, somebody could get killed if that scaffold gave way in a situation like that. So 457C supported scaffolds, poles, legs, posts, frames, and uprights must be plumb and they must be braced. So the first part of our scaffold that we put up must be level, it must be plumb, and it should be braced with cross braces. As you can see in this picture, anything that is not level, not plumb on the first buck, as we move up, it will become more and more unlevel, uneven, causing more and more possibility for fatality or serious injury. So leveling the first level, making sure it is plumb, is of utmost importance when we are building scaffold. This is something that the competent person, they need to be aware of and they need to keep track of when scaffolding is getting built. Access to scaffold, anytime that first step onto a scaffold is greater than 2 feet, we must put some type of an access point there, whether it is a step, stairs, a ramp, or similar access. But that first step cannot be any more than 24 inches or 2 feet. At no time do we use cross braces for access. Hook-on ladders are a great option, but they must be so positioned so that they do not cause the scaffold to tip. And at every 35 foot of a scaffold, we must have some type of a resting point. Several companies have hook-on ladders. They work great. What we have to maintain, we have to think about is that first rung, that first step, is less than 2 feet off the ground. The minimum rung width, 11.5 inches. The rungs must be uniformly placed, which they would be on a manufacturer's built ladder. 16 3/4 inch rung spacing, and they must be slip-resistant treads on stairs and landings. Stairs provided for scaffolding, handrails, smooth and no hazardous projections, 28 to 37 inches high, and at least 18 inches wide for easy access. Our riser height must be uniform within 1/4 inch of each other, and the angle of the climb must be between 40 to 60 degrees. And if you buy these, if you rent these from scaffolding companies, they would all meet this standard for safety and to make sure that nobody gets hurt. Prefab scaffold access. They can be constructed into the ends of the scaffold. And here again, they must meet the right length and width for ladder access. And they must be uniformly placed. There are several scaffolding manufacturers that do make ladder access ends for their scaffolding. Some of them are walk-through masonry scaffolds. If it's a walk-through masonry scaffold, those are not access ladders on the ends. If it is an access ladder, the rungs will be spaced properly. You must stack your bucks properly to make sure that the ladder goes straight up. And in those areas where we are using that as a ladder, we must use a pick for our platform on our scaffold, as opposed to using plank that extends out into the ladder area. So these are just a couple of things that we have to think about when we are using that scaffold ladder access for access to our scaffolding. Erectors and dismantlers must be provided with safe means of access, and the competent person must determine what that safe means is. Must be based on the conditions and the scaffolding type. Attachable ladders must be installed as soon as possible to grant access to these mantlers and dismantlers. Horizontal members used for access not more than 22 inches apart. And here again, we cannot use cross braces for access while we are building or dismantling scaffold. This is probably one of the hardest things when it comes to scaffolding, is to build them and to dismantle them safely. It is very difficult to put personal fall arrest systems on because ladder manufacturers are hesitant to say that that anchor point for a ladder or for a scaffold that is being constructed will withstand that 5,000 pounds of anchorage of force that is required for an anchorage for a personal fall arrest system. So erecting and dismantling scaffolding is very, very dangerous, must be done with experienced people and under the direct supervision of a competent person. Here we have an individual who is using the tower illegally, improperly, to gain access either up or down. The problem with this, it is very dangerous for him, but it is also a citable offense per the OSHA standard. Here we have another individual that is using a tower, either going up or going down, instead of using a ladder that is supplied or a stair tower that is supplied. No loading in excess of the intended or rated load. So here again, we must understand the scaffolding that we build, the load that we are planning on applying to that scaffold, whether it's brick, block, lumber, equipment, tools, whatever the case may be, we have to understand how much all of this weighs. A lean-to scaffold is strictly prohibited under the OSHA standard for construction sites. Competent person is to inspect for defects during each shift, but also during any type of wind or weather event that could have caused damage or caused that scaffolding to move. The competent person must inspect that. And any damaged scaffold must be repaired or replaced or braced when it is found out that scaffolding is defective. That should be tagged, do not use. It should be put out of service so that it does not get used. It should be taken back to the shop and destroyed if it cannot be used. Repairing anything like this must be under the direct supervision or the direct guidance of the manufacturer. Moving scaffolds. No scaffolds can be moved with employees on them unless specifically designed by a professional engineer for such. Working around electrical lines, less than 300 volts, you must be at least 3 feet away. 300 to 500 or 50 kilovolts, you must be at least 10 feet away. Please don't confuse orange wraps with insulation. Anytime you are working around scaffold, around power lines with scaffold, you should have at least, to be on the safe side, at least 10 feet away, and make sure that your equipment, your forklifts, your equipment like that will maintain at least a 10-foot barrier, 10-foot distance away from those power lines. Scaffolds erected, moved, dismantled, or altered only under the supervision and direction of a competent person qualified under the use of scaffolds. If it's snowy and ice, that must be removed before scaffolding is going to get used. And swing loads near scaffolds must always use a tag line in order to keep them from crashing into scaffolding. We cannot increase the working height with makeshift devices on any type of scaffold. We see people using 5-gallon buckets. That increases the height, that takes them above the guardrail height. People do use ladders. The only time they can use a ladder is if that platform is secured, or if the ladder is placed against other surfaces, the scaffolding also must be secured, thus resisting the side load that is created by that ladder. The platforms that we use, whether it's planking or picks, must not deflect any more than 1/60th of the span when loaded. So you can see that a big deflection could cause that to collapse and also put undue strain on the scaffold itself. I talked about this earlier. Per the standard 1926 451G fall protection, the standard specifically says that fall protection is required anytime anybody is working on a scaffolding above the 10-foot level. That's the OSHA standard. However, most contractors in Northwest Ohio require any type of fall protection at the 6-foot level, so as to avoid any confusion, whether it's a 10-foot trigger height or a 6-foot trigger height. Northwest Ohio contractors are saying 6-foot trigger height, whether you're working on scaffold, whether you're just working on a roof edge, whether you're working on steel erection. Anytime your feet are above 6 foot or more above lower level, you will be protected from the fall, whether it's with guardrails or personal fall arrest system. Keep in mind, when bricklaying is being done, there is a bit of an exception for those bricklayers up there working, so that they do not have guardrails in front of them while they are working. Anything behind them, they must be protected from the fall that's on the scaffold. Guardrail systems. On any open edge of a scaffold, a guardrail system must be in place when individuals are working on that level. So on the back side and on the ends must be guardrailed. Even on the outrigger supports, the work platforms that some people are working on, those must have F brackets on there also, or a means of fall protection, a guardrail system, to keep people from falling off of those platforms also. Guardrail systems, 38 to 45 inches high. On these manufactured guardrails, there are pins that's where you hook your guardrails up to. The mid-rail will be half of that, and we have to keep in mind also that toe boards must be applied, must be installed on scaffold when tools and equipment are above that. That is simply a protection to keep things from falling down, hitting people below us. The top rail strength on suspended scaffolds will withstand 100 pounds. All other types of scaffold must withstand 200 pounds of force for their scaffold guardrail. The guardrail can also be 2x4s, wire tied with number 9 wire at that height, 38 to 45 inches high. And also mid-rails can also be used, 2x4s can be used as mid-rails also. Halfway between the top rail and the platform. Cross bracing is acceptable in place of a mid-rail when the crossing point of two braces is between 20 and 30 inches above the work platform, or the top rail crosses in the middle between 38 and 48 inches above the work platform. But the end points of each upright shall be no more than 48 inches apart. Falling object protection on scaffold requires hard hats. Hard hats are required 100% of the time when working around scaffold. Whether you're on the scaffold or you're under the scaffold, hard hats are required. Toe boards are necessary, screens, if there is a danger that material will fall to the public below or to the working people below. Also debris nets and even canopies on busy walkways or busy areas underneath. When is falling object protection required? Anytime employees below could be struck by falling objects. We need to barricade the area, no access, toe boards installed of sufficient length, canopies installed, and material piled higher than the toe board must be screened to make sure that that material does not fall on anybody below. Here's a good picture of a toe board that is absolutely useless because the platform does not reach out to the toe board area. We have our guardrail in place, the toe board's in place, but there's a large gap between the platform and the toe board. Here we have no guardrail in place. Whether you use the 10-foot or the 6-foot trigger height, that is higher than 10 foot. So guardrail must be in place in order to protect these people from the fall. This individual is working off of a scaffold that is greater than 10 foot in height also. And once again, no guardrail. Guardrail should be all the way around that scaffold to protect that individual from falling. Should also be cordoned off or netting or something there to protect any equipment from falling down and hitting somebody on the sidewalk. These individuals, same thing, no guardrail, no fall protection. If you can't use guardrail, if you can tie into a building for fall protection, that's great. In this case, none of that is taking place right now. All open, unprotected falling could happen here. These individuals, the same thing. Improperly planked and also greater than 10-foot fall and no guardrails. no personal fall arrest systems. This individual right here, I actually took this picture myself. It's hard to discern, but that rope is holding up. There is a rope holding up the end of that scaffold while that individual installs these windows in this building. And we have to keep in mind that a lot of these pictures are taken from a distance. A lot of these individuals will not even know that OSHA is taking these pictures until OSHA comes knocking on their door and says, hey, look what I've got. We'll touch on aerial lifts very quickly, complying with ANSI A92.2, the 1969 standard. That's what's incorporated by reference into the OSHA standards, not the new 2020 standards. But your lift controls, we must test them every day prior to each use. These lifts must be operated only by authorized personnel. We cannot tie off to any adjacent pole or building. We can never stand on guardrails of an aerial lift. Whether it's an aerial lift, articulating boom platform, our feet must be firmly planted on the floor at all times. Harness and a lanyard, harness and a self-retracting lifeline must be worn in an articulating boom platform. Boom load limits must not be exceeded. So here again, we must understand the weight limit of these booms, whether it's an articulating boom platform or a scissors lift. Set the brakes when it is in use, when the outriggers are used, positioned on pads or a solid surface. When we move our aerial lifts, we must bring the aerial lift down and then move it. If we leave it elevated, it changes the dynamics of the vehicle, giving it the opportunity to tip over because of a different center of gravity than what it is accustomed to while traveling. Training for scaffolds. Like I said at the beginning, each employee who works on a scaffold must be trained to recognize and avoid hazards, including electrical hazards, fall hazards, and falling objects in the work area. This training must be either done by the employer or it must be verified that this individual has had this training by someone else. It is the employer's responsibility to be sure that these individuals have proper training for scaffolding. Training for the proper use of scaffold, proper procedures for fall protection, falling object protection, maximum intended load. How do we calculate the items that we are putting on that scaffold? And any other applicable regulations for scaffolding. Competent person must conduct training. He must verify that these individuals are trained to work on scaffolding. Competent person must be there when we are operating, moving, repairing any type of scaffolding components. So it is a big deal for competent persons to understand the importance of scaffolding. If there is a lack of training, the employers are responsible to make sure that these individuals are trained properly for new hazards, new equipment, while working around and on scaffolding. For any other questions regarding scaffolding, 1926 standard, 29 CFR 1926.450 will answer questions, references for the scaffolding standard. I appreciate your time. Please be safe. Thank you.